A corrupt judge mocks a black teen in court, laughing as he hands down a sentence that could ruin her life forever. He thinks it's just another case, another powerless victim, but he has no idea who's watching from the back of the courtroom. Because this time, someone with the power to destroy him is taking notes, and they won't let him get away with it. What secrets is this judge hiding? And how far will he go to keep the truth buried? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in courtroom 7B, casting harsh shadows across the worn wooden benches. The air hung heavy with tension and the faint scent of lemon-scented cleaner. Amara Lewis stood alone, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into her wrists. Her faded purple hoodie hung loose on her thin frame, and her torn jeans made her look even smaller against the massive oak judge's bench that loomed before her. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to ease the ache in her legs from standing so long. Judge Conrad Blake peered down, his silver hair perfectly styled, his black robes crisp and intimidating. His gold cufflinks caught the light as he adjusted his sleeve. His cold eyes studied Amara like a scientist examining an insect under glass. The corner of his mouth twitched up in a smirk that made her stomach turn, his practiced expression of disdain all too familiar in this courtroom. "You people never learn, do you?" His voice carried across the silent courtroom, each word dripping with contempt. "Just another statistic." The words echoed off the high ceiling, making several spectators flinch. In the front row, Denise Lewis gripped the wooden armrest so hard her knuckles turned white. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't make a sound. She'd been here before, watching another child face an unfair system. Her wedding ring glinted as she dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, her shoulders trembling with silent sobs. Hidden in the back row, Eleanor Hayes sat perfectly still, her elegant posture a stark contrast to the slouching court officers. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her tailored navy suit immaculate. Her pen moved steadily across her notepad, recording every word, every gesture, every injustice. Her eyes never left the proceedings, missing nothing. The prosecutor stood, smoothing his expensive tie with manicured fingers. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear." He gestured to the large screen where grainy security footage played on a loop. A hooded figure moved through Calloway's jewelry, stuffing items into a bag. The timestamp blinked steadily in the corner. The defendant was caught on camera. Raymond Calloway rose from his seat, his designer suit and gold watch glinting under the harsh lights. His face was flushed with righteous indignation as he pointed a manicured finger at Amara. "That's her, Your Honor. I saw her with my own eyes." The jeweler's voice quivered with practiced outrage. Amara's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. "That's not me," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, carrying across the hushed courtroom. "I wasn't there. This is a mistake." Her words rang with truth that nobody seemed to hear. Her court-appointed lawyer, Damian Cross, slouched in his chair, absently clicking his pen. His rumpled suit and loosened tie spoke of calculated indifference. He didn't even look up when Amara spoke. He hadn't objected once during the entire trial, though a slight tension in his jaw suggested he wasn't as disinterested as he appeared. Judge Blake's face darkened like storm clouds gathering. "Mistake?" He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of his bench until his knuckles whitened. "Oh, I think the mistake was giving you the benefit of the doubt." His voice held the finality of a coffin lid closing. The gavel crashed down like a thunderclap, making several people jump. 18 months in juvenile detention. Case closed. "No!" Denise's scream pierced the air, raw with maternal anguish. "My baby. She's innocent." Her cry echoed off the walls, a sound of pure heartbreak. Two court officers moved swiftly, their boots squeaking on the polished floor as they grabbed Amara's arms. As they dragged her toward the exit, she caught sight of Eleanor Hayes. Their eyes met for just a moment, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. A silent promise hung in the air. Eleanor lowered her head, her hands clenched into tight fists on her lap, perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. She had witnessed enough. The slight tremor in her shoulders betrayed the fury she kept carefully contained beneath her composed exterior. Hours later, the grandfather clock in Eleanor's study chimed midnight, its deep resonance echoing through the book-lined walls like a solemn reminder of time slipping away. She sat in her leather chair, her reading glasses perched on her nose as the blue light from her phone illuminated the deep lines of concentration on her face. On the small screen, she watched the courtroom footage she'd secretly recorded earlier that day, her jaw tightening each time Blake's voice rang out, each word making her stomach clench with familiar anger. "You people never learn," his recorded voice sneered, dripping with the same condescension she'd heard countless times before. Eleanor paused the video, her finger hovering over the screen, trembling slightly with suppressed rage. Rising from her chair with deliberate slowness, she moved to a filing cabinet in the corner, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The metal drawer slid open with a familiar screech that seemed too loud in the midnight quiet. Her fingers traced the labeled tabs until they found what she was looking for, muscle memory leading the way. She pulled out a thick manila folder marked Malik Lewis, sentenced 2018. The pages inside were worn from repeated handling, the corners soft from years of being turned, each page a testament to countless nights spent searching for justice. "It's happening again," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper in the quiet room, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. The same pattern, the same judge, the same cruel smile that had haunted her thoughts for years. She glanced at the young man's photo paper-clipped to the file. Another life Blake had tried to destroy, another soul caught in his web of corruption. With determined movements steady despite the late hour, she picked up her phone and dialed Damian Cross's number. An hour later, the fluorescent lights of Joe's all-night diner cast harsh shadows across their booth, the buzzing tubes creating an oddly fitting backdrop for their clandestine meeting. The coffee was bitter and burnt tasting, and the vinyl seats squeaked with every movement, but it was private enough for what they needed to discuss, tucked away in a corner where few would notice them. Eleanor watched Damian stir his coffee endlessly, his tie loosened and jacket wrinkled as if he'd been wearing it for days. "I saw the way you handled that case today," she said, her voice carefully neutral, though her eyes missed nothing. Damian looked up, a hint of defiance in his eyes, mixed with something darker. "And? You're going to tell me how bad I am at my job?" His words carried a challenge, but there was something else beneath them, a careful calculation, a chess player considering his next move. Without speaking, Eleanor reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope, worn at the edges from frequent handling. She slid it across the table, careful to keep it below the line of sight from the windows, her movements precise and practiced. "You and I both know the truth." Damian's fingers traced the edge of the envelope, but he didn't open it, understanding its contents without looking. Inside were hundreds of pages documenting Blake's history of corrupt rulings, each one carefully collected over years of patient observation, a damning chronicle of injustice. "We don't have much time," Eleanor added, her voice dropping lower, barely audible above the quiet hum of the diner's refrigerators. The late-night waitress passed by with a pot of coffee, and they both fell silent until she was out of earshot, their eyes following her retreat. Damian stared at the envelope for a long moment, then slowly nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. His carefully crafted mask of incompetence fell away, revealing sharp intelligence in his eyes. "Where do we start?" "We need to find out who really robbed Calloway's store," Eleanor replied, pulling out a small notebook, its pages filled with her neat, precise handwriting. "The real thief is still out there, and that's our way in. That's how we begin to unravel everything." They bent their heads together over the table, their coffee growing cold and forgotten, as they began plotting their first move against Judge Conrad Blake's corrupt empire. The late-night hours ticking away as they laid the groundwork for justice. The juvenile detention center's processing room was a cold, sterile space that smelled of bleach and despair. Amara stood shivering as female officers barked orders at her, their voices echoing off the concrete walls like angry thunder. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the institutional green tiles. "Strip," "Everything off," one officer commanded, snapping latex gloves onto her hands with practiced efficiency. Amara's fingers trembled as she removed her clothes piece by piece, each item tossed into a plastic bag labeled personal effects. The hoodie her mother had given her for Christmas, still soft from countless washes, her worn sneakers with the lucky penny stuck in the sole, even the small silver cross necklace she always wore. All of it disappeared into the bag, taking pieces of her identity with them. The orange jumpsuit they gave her was stiff and scratchy against her skin, a size too big and smelling of industrial detergent that made her nose burn. As they led her through the corridors, other girls in identical jumpsuits watched her pass, their faces a gallery of emotions. Some eyes held hostility, others complete indifference, as if she were just another face in an endless parade of new arrivals. A few showed hints of sympathy, quickly masked. Her assigned cell was barely bigger than her bedroom closet at home, with gray walls covered in years of institutional paint. 2 metal bunks were bolted to the wall, and a stainless steel toilet sat exposed in the corner, a cruel reminder of lost privacy. Her cellmate, Tasha, was a tall girl with hard eyes and tight cornrows who barely glanced up from her dog-eared paperback when Amara entered. Amara's lower lip quivered as she sat on the bottom bunk, the thin mattress offering little comfort against the metal frame. The springs creaked under her weight, a sound that would become all too familiar. "Don't cry," Tasha said flatly, not looking up from her book, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "This ain't a place for weakness." Amara swallowed hard and lifted her chin, squaring her shoulders despite the fear churning in her stomach. "I won't," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Across town in Eleanor's elegant home office, Damien spread out surveillance footage stills across her mahogany desk, the wood gleaming under soft lamplight. The grainy images from an ATM camera across from Calloway's store told a very different story than the one presented in court, each frame a piece of damning evidence. "There," Eleanor pointed to a figure in one frame, her manicured nail tapping the image decisively. "That's not Amara." The timestamp matched the robbery exactly, but the person in the footage was clearly male, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with confident familiarity. In the next frame, his face was briefly visible as he turned toward the camera, features clear enough to be unmistakable. "Bryce Calloway," Damien said, his voice tight with controlled anger, fingers curling into fists at his sides. "The store owner's son." They watched as Bryce hurried to a parked police cruiser, slipping inside with practiced ease that suggested this wasn't his first time. The officer behind the wheel was someone they recognized. Officer James Miller, known to be on Judge Blake's payroll, his badge number clearly visible in the streetlight. Armed with this evidence, Damien and Eleanor drove to Raymond Calloway's store through the quiet evening streets. The closed sign hung in the window, but lights were still on inside, casting a yellow glow onto the sidewalk. Damien knocked firmly on the glass door, the sound sharp in the night air. Calloway appeared, his face falling when he recognized them, worry lines deepening around his mouth. He opened the door just enough to speak through the gap, security chain still in place. "We're closed. We have footage of your son robbing your store," Damien said without preamble, holding up a tablet showing the ATM video, its screen bright in the darkness. "The same night you claimed Amara Lewis did it." Color drained from Calloway's face as he watched his son on the screen, caught in crystal-clear detail by the ATM's camera. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice cold and precise as a surgeon's blade. "Either you talk, or you go down with Blake." Calloway's lips parted slightly, fear flickering in his eyes like a trapped animal's. For a moment, it seemed he might speak, might choose the right path. Instead, he slammed the door in their faces, the sound echoing through the empty street like a gunshot. Damien and Eleanor exchanged knowing looks in the gathering dusk. They had seen it. The flash of terror in Calloway's eyes at the mention of Blake's name. The way his hands had started to shake. That fear told them everything they needed to know. They had their leverage, and now it was just a matter of time before someone broke. Meanwhile, in his dimly lit chambers, Judge Conrad Blake paced behind his mahogany desk, his face twisted with barely contained rage. The evening shadows cast long fingers across the room as three men sat before him. Raymond Calloway, fidgeting nervously in his expensive suit, tugging repeatedly at his silk tie. Police Chief Randall Briggs looking stone-faced and dangerous with his hands folded in his lap, and District Attorney Michael Preston carefully maintaining his political poker face, his fingers drumming silently on the armrest. Blake slammed a folder onto his desk, making Calloway jump. The sound echoed through the wood-paneled room like a gunshot. Someone's been accessing sealed records, digging through old cases. His voice was quiet but carried the promise of violence. They think they can come after me? Chief Briggs leaned forward, his badge catching the lamplight, the metal gleaming ominously. Who's stupid enough to try? His weathered face hardened into granite. Eleanor Hayes. Blake spat the name like poison, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his desk. That self-righteous fossil should have stayed retired. And that public defender, Cross, he's not as incompetent as he pretends to be. Been watching him for weeks now. Calloway wiped sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. They have footage of Bryce, from the ATM across. Shut up, Briggs snapped, making Calloway shrink into his chair like a scolded child. Blake's thin lips curved into a cruel smile, his eyes cold and calculating in the dim light. They want to play a game? Fine. Let's remind them who makes the rules in this town. Across town, Denise Lewis stood in her apartment doorway, staring at the pink slip in her hands, her entire world crumbling around the edges. After 15 years at the hospital, where she'd never missed a single day, they'd fired her for performance issues that hadn't existed the day before. Her hands trembled as she pushed open the door and froze, her heart stopping in her chest. The walls of her home were covered in spray-painted racial slurs, black paint dripping like tears down the faded wallpaper. Their family photos lay shattered on the floor, precious memories under broken glass crunching under her feet as she stepped inside. The air reeked of paint and violation, the smell of hate filling her nostrils. Her phone buzzed, a call from the prison where Malik was serving time. Her son's voice was tight with controlled fear, each word measured carefully. Mom, these guards, they came to my cell last night. 3 of them standing there in the dark. Said to tell you and everyone else to back off. They know things about Amara's case. He paused, breathing hard, his voice barely above a whisper. They said next time they won't just talk. At an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, Eleanor and Damien met under flickering fluorescent lights that cast strange shadows on the walls. Their footsteps echoed off concrete walls as they found each other among rusted machinery, the air thick with dust and tension. Blake knows we're coming for him, Eleanor said, her voice grave, her normally steady hands slightly trembling. He's already retaliating. Denise Lewis lost her job today. Their apartment was vandalized. He's sending a message. Damien's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching beneath his skin. Then we hit him harder, make him regret starting this war. Eleanor pulled out a sealed manila envelope, aged and worn at the edges, yellowed with time and weighted with secrets. She held it for a moment, as if weighing its contents against her conscience, her fingers tracing the sealed edge. There's something I never told you about Blake, she said quietly, her voice heavy with years of guilt. Something that could destroy him completely. She extended the envelope, years of secrets contained within its simple paper walls, her hand steady now with determination. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered on at 6 a.m. sharp, jolting Amara awake. The metallic clang of cell doors echoed through the juvenile detention center, accompanied by the sharp smell of industrial bleach that made her nose burn. She sat up on the thin mattress, her orange jumpsuit scratching against her skin like sandpaper, and tried to get her bearings in the cold, gray cell that felt more like a tomb than a room. Tasha, her cellmate, was already up, making her bed with military precision, tucking corners tight enough to bounce a quarter. She glanced at Amara with hard eyes that had seen too much, eyes that carried the weight of countless sleepless nights. First rule, make your bed perfect. They'll write you up for anything. She paused, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. The guards don't care about us. The system's built to keep us in here, and they make sure we know it every single day. At breakfast, Amara clutched her plastic tray so hard her knuckles turned white, scanning the crowded cafeteria with its peeling paint and scratched tables. The food looked like gray mush with mysterious lumps, but her stomach growled anyway, reminding her that hunger didn't care about appearance. Two girls waved her over, Jasmine, tall and willowy with braids pulled back so tight they looked painful, and Keisha, shorter with kind eyes despite the tough expression she wore like armor. "You're the new girl from Blake's court?" Jasmine asked, pushing her food around with a plastic spork, her movements slow and deliberate. Amara nodded, sitting down carefully, conscious of every eye on her. "That man's been sending girls here for years," Keisha said, leaning in close enough that Amara could smell her standard-issue soap. "I got 18 months for shoplifting a candy bar. Jasmine? They said she was selling drugs, but the only thing in her backpack was aspirin for her little sister's headaches." "Most of us were set up," Jasmine added quietly, her voice barely carrying over the cafeteria's constant hum. "Or got way more time than we should have. Blake's got it down to a science." Amara felt her chest tighten as she looked around the cafeteria, seeing dozens of young faces that shouldn't be there, each one carrying a story of injustice. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was systematic, a well-oiled machine designed to grind them down. From his office window overlooking the yard, Warden Martin Graves watched Amara with calculating eyes, like a hawk studying its prey. His expensive suit and gold watch stood in stark contrast to the prison's dreary interior, a reminder of the divide between keeper and kept. A guard brought him coffee in a fine china cup, no plastic trays for him, the steam rising in delicate wisps. Throughout the day, guards seemed to materialize whenever Amara moved, their boots squeaking against the polished floors. During yard time, one deliberately bumped into her, sending her stumbling. At lunch, another knocked her tray to the floor, scattering the unappetizing food across the tiles. During class, they interrupted her constantly, trying to provoke a reaction, their smirks growing with each disruption. "Keep your cool," Tasha whispered during their work detail folding laundry, her hands moving mechanically through the endless pile of identical orange jumpsuits. "They want you to act out. More time for them. Less freedom for you. That's how they win." Amara noticed how the system worked, like a complex machine designed to crush spirits. Write-ups for beds not perfectly made. Extra days added for talking back. Solitary confinement for the smallest infractions, turning minutes into hours and hours into eternities. She started memorizing every rule, every schedule, every procedure, building a mental fortress of knowledge. She wouldn't give them any excuse to extend her sentence, wouldn't let them see her break. That night, after lights out, something scratched against the concrete floor like a mouse seeking crumbs. A folded piece of paper slid under their cell door, the white standing out against the darkness. Amara's hands shook as she picked it up and read the message scrawled in harsh black ink, each letter a threat. "Stay quiet, do your time, or things get worse." Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she straightened her shoulders in the darkness, drawing strength from deep within. They wanted her scared. They wanted her broken. But Amara Lewis wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. She had truth on her side, and truth was stronger than any prison wall. Eleanor and Damien pushed through the heavy glass doors of Calloway's jewelry, the bell chiming overhead like a warning. The familiar scent of polished metal and leather display cases filled the air. Raymond Calloway stood behind the counter, his usually pristine appearance showing signs of strain. His tie hung loose, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his normally well-groomed silver hair was slightly disheveled. "Back again?" he said, trying to sound dismissive, but his voice cracked slightly. His fingers drummed nervously on the glass countertop. Eleanor placed a manila envelope on the glass counter with deliberate slowness, the soft scraping sound echoing in the quiet store. "You should look at these, Raymond." Her tone was calm, but carried steel beneath it. She stood perfectly still, radiating quiet authority. Calloway's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. The color drained from his face as he looked at the crystal-clear photos. His son Bryce, clear as day, stealing the very necklace Amara was convicted of taking. The timestamp in the corner of each photo was damning evidence. "You can keep covering for your son," Eleanor said, her eyes never leaving Calloway's face. "Or you can help us and walk away from this." She adjusted her silk scarf with steady hands, the gesture somehow making her seem even more formidable. Sweat beaded on Calloway's forehead as he shuffled the photos like a deck of cards. "You don't understand. This is bigger than you." His voice was barely above a whisper. Across town, in the VIP section of Club Azure, Bryce Calloway sprawled on a leather couch, drunk on expensive champagne and his own sense of invulnerability. Crystal glasses clinked around him as the bass thumped through the dimly lit space, blue neon lights casting eerie shadows as he held court among his equally privileged friends. "You should have seen it," Bryce slurred, sloshing his drink onto his designer shirt. "Dad got some black girl locked up for the whole thing. 18 months. He laughed, the sound ugly and sharp, like breaking glass. His friends joined in, their collective mirth echoing off the walls. What Bryce didn't notice was Marcus Webb, sitting quietly at the end of the bar, nursing a club soda with lime. The investigative journalist's hand tightened around his glass as he recorded every word on his phone, hidden beneath a napkin. His eyes narrowed as Bryce continued to brag, each detail another nail in the coffin of this case. The young man's loose tongue was giving them everything they needed. Later that night, Raymond Calloway sat alone in his darkened store, staring at the security cameras. Shadows played across the empty display cases, and his reflection in the mirrors made him look older, more haunted. The bell chimed again, but this time it brought a chill. Chief Randall Briggs's heavy footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he approached, his police badge glinting dully in the low light. The smell of cigarette smoke preceded him. Briggs towered over the counter, his presence filling the space with menace. His uniform was crisp, but his eyes were cold and hard. "Heard you had some visitors today." His voice was quiet but carried the weight of a threat. He picked up a small crystal figurine, turning it over in his massive hands. Calloway's shoulders slumped, defeat written in every line of his body. "I didn't tell them anything." His voice was hollow, empty. "Good." Briggs leaned in close, his breath hot on Calloway's face, smelling of coffee and mint. "You even think about flipping on us, you and your son will go down together." He set the crystal figurine down with exaggerated care. Calloway gripped the edge of the counter until his knuckles turned white, the truth of his situation crushing down on him. The security cameras blinked their red light steadily, recording everything and nothing. If he talked, Blake and his people would destroy everything he'd built. He was trapped, and they all knew it. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a physical thing, suffocating and inescapable. Amara's footsteps echoed through the quiet corridor as she made her way back to her cell after dinner. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows along the concrete walls. Her muscles tensed as she heard multiple sets of footsteps behind her, the sound growing closer with each passing second. Before she could turn around, rough hands grabbed her shoulders and slammed her against the wall with enough force to knock the wind from her lungs. 3 older inmates towered over her, their faces twisted with manufactured anger that didn't quite reach their eyes. The biggest one, a girl with a snake tattoo coiling up her neck like a deadly vine, pulled back her fist, knuckles white with tension. "Hey!" Jasmine's voice rang out like a bell through the stillness. She and Keisha sprinted down the corridor, their orange jumpsuits bright under the harsh lights, their faces set with determination. The attackers hesitated, looking between their target and the newcomers, clearly weighing their odds. Keisha, tall and athletic with shoulders that spoke of years of training, stepped forward with her fists clenched. "Back off. Now." Her words carried the weight of a promise. A guard stood at the end of the hallway, watching with deliberate indifference, his face a mask of practiced disinterest. He slowly turned and walked away as the fight broke up, his boots clicking against the concrete floor. Later, in the relative safety of her cell, Amara sat on her thin mattress while Jasmine pressed a cold washcloth to her bruised shoulder, her gentle touch at odds with the anger in her eyes. "The guards set this up," Jasmine explained, her voice low and bitter, barely above a whisper. "They want you scared, make you desperate. Then they offer you a deal, like it's some kind of twisted favor." Across town, in Judge Blake's wood-paneled office, 3 men sat in leather chairs, sharing expensive whiskey that cost more than a month's salary for most people. Blake swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass while Police Chief Randall Briggs lounged with calculated casualness, his badge gleaming dully in the dim light. Warden Martin Graves sat forward, his prison keys jingling at his belt like a jailer's warning bells. "She's a loose end," Blake said, his voice cold as winter frost, each word precise and measured. "I want her broken." He set down his glass with precise control, not a drop spilled. Graves nodded, a cruel smile playing at his lips, the expression of a man who enjoyed his work too much. "I'll have my guards increase the pressure. Random searches, lost mail, whatever it takes. We know how to handle troublemakers." Meanwhile, in a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, Eleanor sat across from a nervous-looking man in his 30s. David Lasky, Blake's former law clerk, couldn't stop fidgeting with his coffee cup, his fingers dancing around the ceramic rim. "I could lose everything," he whispered, glancing around the nearly empty cafe, his eyes darting to each new customer like a hunted animal. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm, carrying decades of authority. "You've already lost something more important by staying silent. Your integrity." Lasky's shoulders slumped under the weight of his conscience. "He made me help him," he admitted, his voice barely audible above the cafe's soft music. "Blake doctored legal documents, changed sentencing recommendations." He swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing. "He specifically targeted black defendants, ordered harsher sentences, said it was good business." Eleanor's breath caught at the admission. "Is there proof?" Lasky nodded slowly, like each movement pained him. "Files, hidden in his private safe, behind the painting in his chambers." His hands shook as he lifted his coffee, liquid sloshing against the sides. "But you didn't hear it from me. He'd destroy me if he knew." The prison mail cart squeaked down the corridor, wheels protesting against the concrete floor like a tired old man's joints. Amara's heart skipped when the guard handed her an envelope with familiar handwriting, the sight of those careful loops and curves making her chest tighten. Her fingers trembled as she opened her brother's letter, careful not to tear the precious paper that carried his words across the miles between them. "Dear Amara," Malik's neat script filled the page, each letter precise and deliberate. "I know what they're doing to you. The same games, the same tricks they used on me. But you're stronger than them. You have to fight back, smart, not with fists but with your mind. They expect anger, but they won't see wisdom coming." Tears blurred her vision as she read his words, each one striking deep into her heart. Tucked inside the letter was a carefully folded piece of paper with a list of names. Next to each one were dates, charges, and sentences, all handed down by Judge Blake, each one a testament to his corruption. Marcus Thompson, 18 months for jaywalking. The sentence was longer than some got for theft. Keisha Williams, 2 years for a parking ticket. She had 3 young children at home. James Carter, 3 years for being disrespectful in court. His only crime had been asking why his public defender hadn't read his case file. The pattern was clear as day. Every name belonged to a black defendant. Every sentence was wildly disproportionate to the offense, a mockery of justice that made her stomach turn. That night, lying on her thin mattress that crackled with every movement, Amara made a decision that would change everything. She tore a blank page from the back of her prison-issued Bible and started writing, her pen pressing hard against the paper. Guard Peterson targets black inmates, provokes fights, then writes them up for aggressive behavior. Guard Martinez sends girls to solitary for looking wrong, but only if their skin is dark enough. She documented everything with meticulous care, each detail another piece of the puzzle. The way certain guards would lose mail from family members, especially during holidays when connection meant the most. How some girls got extra time for infractions that others got away with, the disparities as clear as black and white. She noted which companies profited from their labor, tracing connections back to Blake's courtroom like a spider following threads in its web. Amara hid her notes inside her mattress, adding to them day by day, building her case one injustice at a time. When Tasha, her cellmate, asked what she was doing, Amara simply said, "Fighting back, the smart way." Her voice was quiet but held steel beneath the softness. She created a system, marking days on her calendar with different symbols, turning corruption into code. A circle meant guard harassment, each one a bruise on Justice's face. A triangle meant someone went to solitary, disappeared into the hole for weeks at a time. A star meant a suspicious sentence extension, another life stretched thin by prejudice. The patterns emerged like constellations of corruption, telling a story of systematic abuse. One afternoon, while she was reviewing her notes, a guard announced, "Lewis, visitor." Amara was led to the visiting room, her heart racing with unexpected hope. Eleanor Hayes sat waiting, legal pad in hand, looking every bit the professional attorney in her crisp blazer and stern expression. "Ms. Lewis," Eleanor said formally, sliding a thick law book across the table with practiced precision. "I'm here to discuss your case. The appeals process can be quite illuminating." As they talked about legal procedures and appeal deadlines, Eleanor's finger tapped the book meaningfully, her eyes conveying messages her words couldn't say. Later, alone in her cell, Amara found a folded note hidden between its pages, tucked between discussions of precedent and procedure. "Keep fighting, you're not alone, the truth has a way of coming to light." The simple message made her heart swell with hope, expanding like a balloon in her chest. For the first time since entering these walls, Amara felt something more powerful than fear. She felt purpose, burning bright and unstoppable. She slipped the note into her growing collection of evidence, a small smile playing at her lips as she smoothed the paper flat. They wanted her broken, but they had no idea how strong she could be. In the darkness of her cell, Amara's determination shone like a beacon, lighting the way forward through the long night ahead. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb sat at his cluttered desk, headphones pressed tightly against his ears as he replayed the audio for the 10th time. Empty coffee cups and scattered documents surrounded his laptop, evidence of countless sleepless nights. Bryce Calloway's drunken voice rang clear through the recording. "My old man got some black girl locked up for my stuff." The journalist's fingers tightened around his pen, his notepad already filled with detailed timestamps and quotes, the ink smudged from his left-handed writing. He recognized Judge Blake's name immediately. 3 years ago, Webb had written a piece about suspicious sentencing patterns in the county, but couldn't prove anything concrete. That failure had haunted him ever since. Now, holding this recording, he felt the familiar surge of determination that came with a breakthrough, his heart racing with the weight of what this could mean. Webb grabbed his phone and dialed his editor, Sarah Chen. His hands were shaking with excitement as he paced the small space between his desk and the wall covered in case notes. "Sarah, I've got something big. Judge Conrad Blake, private prisons, and a wrongful conviction case. A 17-year-old girl is sitting in juvie for a crime the store owner's son admitted to committing." "Blake?" Sarah's voice carried a note of concern. "Marcus, you know how this works. Going after a sitting judge is different than exposing a corrupt cop. You better have airtight proof, or he'll bury not just the story, but your career. Remember what happened to Rodriguez at the Herald?" Webb spent the next 3 days diving deep into Blake's financial records, surviving on vending machine snacks and energy drinks. Hidden behind layers of shell companies and careful accounting, he found a pattern of wire transfers. Every month, like clockwork, money flowed from private prison contractors into accounts connected to Blake's family members, each transaction carefully disguised but forming an unmistakable pattern. In a dimly lit parking garage, Webb met his source, a former guard who refused to give his name. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows as the man's hands shook as he lit a cigarette. "Blake's been feeding kids into the system for years," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "Mostly black and brown kids. Poor kids. Nobody who could fight back." "How does it work?" Webb asked, his recorder running quietly in his pocket, his breath visible in the cold air. "Simple math. They keep the prisons full and the money keeps flowing. Blake hands down harsh sentences. The private prisons get their government funding and everyone gets their cut. The kids? The former guard shook his head, flicking ash from his trembling cigarette. They're just numbers on a spreadsheet, but I've seen their faces. I've watched them break. Webb worked through the night, crafting his article carefully. His eyes burned from staring at the screen, but he couldn't stop. He focused on the financial connections, laying out the evidence of Blake's ties to private prison contractors. He included statistics showing the disproportionate sentencing of minority youth in Blake's courtroom, letting the numbers tell their own damning story. Each paragraph was meticulously fact-checked, knowing that a single mistake could derail everything. When the article went live, it spread like wildfire across social media. Local activist groups shared it, adding their own stories of encounters with Blake's courtroom. Former defendants came forward, describing similar experiences of harsh sentences for minor offenses. The story took on a life of its own, growing bigger than Webb had imagined. In his chambers, Blake's face turned red as he read the article on his tablet. His expensive leather chair creaked as he shifted uncomfortably, and his hands trembled as he dialed Chief Randall Briggs's number. "Have you seen this?" Blake's voice was tight with rage, his carefully maintained control cracking. "I'm looking at it now," Briggs replied, his tone grim and businesslike. "Find out who's talking," Blake demanded, his knuckles white against the tablet. "Shut it down. Whatever it takes. I won't let some second-rate reporter destroy everything we've built." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Amara sat cross-legged on her bunk, surrounded by a small group of girls. Her fingers moved quickly across borrowed paper as she explained legal terms in simple language they could all understand. The harsh institutional lighting cast unflattering shadows across their young faces, making them look older than their years. "See here? They violated procedure during your arrest," she told Maria, a 15-year-old who'd been sentenced for shoplifting. "We can use that in your appeal." Maria's eyes widened with hope, her fingers tracing the words Amara had written. Word spread through the juvenile detention center like wildfire. Girls from other blocks started asking for her help during yard time, passing messages through trusted friends. Amara taught them about their rights, showed them how to document guard misconduct, and helped draft appeals in clear, precise language. She worked tirelessly, using every spare moment to help her fellow inmates understand the system that had trapped them. Keisha watched from her perch on the metal table, shaking her head with a mixture of admiration and concern. Her braids swayed as she spoke. "You're dangerous, girl. That's why they're scared of you. You're teaching us to fight back with our minds instead of our fists." The summons to Warden Graves' office came during lunch, interrupting her meal of bland meatloaf and overcooked vegetables. 2 guards escorted her through cold corridors to a wood-paneled office that reeked of cigarettes and cheap air freshener. The walls were lined with framed certificates and awards, a display of authority that felt hollow. Graves sat behind his desk, his tie loose around his thick neck, eyes hard as steel. "Sit down, Lewis," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. His leather chair creaked as he shifted his weight. "I've been watching you. Smart girl like you shouldn't waste her time here. I could help with that." Amara's heart pounded against her ribs, but she kept her face neutral. She'd learned that skill quickly behind these walls, perfecting the art of hiding her emotions. "Keep quiet, stop stirring the pot. Do your time and I'll make sure you get out early." Graves leaned forward, his smile never reaching his eyes, the fluorescent lights reflecting off his balding head. Simple as that. Amara thought of Maria, of all the other girls who needed help, who had no one else to turn to. "No thank you, sir," she said quietly but firmly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. That night, they came for her. Heavy boots in the darkness, rough hands yanking her from sleep. The metal frame of her bunk rattled as they dragged her away. They pulled her down empty corridors to the solitary wing, their footsteps echoing against concrete walls. The cell was barely bigger than a closet, with nothing but a thin mattress and a steel toilet. The walls seemed to close in around her. The door slammed shut with a metallic clang, leaving her in near total darkness. The message couldn't have been clearer. This is what happens when you don't play along. Only a thin strip of light from under the door provided any connection to the outside world. Hours or days later, time lost meaning in solitary, guards pulled her out for a legal visit. Her legs shook from weakness as they led her to the meeting room, her muscles protesting every step. Eleanor and Damien waited there, both looking professional and detached for the cameras, but their eyes held concern when they saw her condition. Amara's voice was hoarse from disuse, scratchy like sandpaper. Her orange jumpsuit hung loose after days of picking at bland food, the fabric swimming on her frame. But her eyes still held their fire, burning with determination. Eleanor slid a legal pad across the table, pointing to specific paragraphs as she spoke about procedural matters. Her manicured finger underlined different words. Journalist. Helping. Soon. The message was clear beneath the pretense of legal consultation. Hold on a little longer, Eleanor whispered as she gathered her papers, the words nearly lost in the shuffle of movement. Her briefcase snapped shut with quiet finality. Amara straightened her shoulders even as exhaustion pulled at her bones. They hadn't broken her. They wouldn't. Each day in solitary only strengthened her resolve to fight back, to help others find their voice in a system designed to silence them. Raymond Calloway sat in his darkened living room, the blue glow of his laptop screen illuminating his haggard face. Dark circles shadowed his eyes as he scrolled through the mounting online comments about his jewelry store, each one more vicious than the last. Racist owner frames innocent girl, one read, the words burning into his vision. Boycott Calloway's, demanded another, followed by a string of angry emoji reactions. His phone buzzed relentlessly with hourly sales reports, each worse than the last, painting a grim picture of his business's rapid decline. His hands trembled as he refreshed the local news website for the 12th time that evening. There it was, a small but damning article mentioning his son Bryce's name in connection with recent thefts. The words seemed to mock him from the screen. His phone lit up with Bryce's caller ID, the bright display cutting through the darkness. Fix this, Dad, I don't care how. Bryce's voice was slurred, probably drunk again, the familiar sound of ice cubes clinking in the background. Make it go away like you always do. You're good at that, aren't you? Calloway ended the call with a sharp jab of his finger, his stomach churning with a mixture of shame and anger. 25 years of building his business, his reputation in the community, all crumbling because of his son's reckless behavior and poor choices. He pulled out Eleanor's business card from his wallet, the edges worn soft from being handled so many times. His fingers hovered over the numbers before finally dialing, each button press feeling like another nail in his coffin. The meeting was set for midnight in the back lot of an abandoned strip mall, where weeds pushed through cracked concrete. Calloway's Mercedes stood out like a sore thumb against the cracked asphalt and faded paint of the derelict building. Eleanor and Damien emerged from the shadows like avenging angels, their faces grave in the dim yellow glow of the security lighting. If I talk, Blake will destroy me. Calloway's voice cracked with fear, his words hanging in the cold night air. You don't know what he's capable of. The things I've seen him do. Eleanor stepped closer, her presence commanding despite her small frame, her steel gray hair catching the light. You talk now, or when the FBI comes knocking. Your choice. Her voice carried the weight of decades in the justice system, each word measured and precise. Blake's empire is falling. Don't go down with it. Be smarter than that. Calloway wiped sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. I want full immunity, written guarantee, everything in black and white. Done. Damien pulled out papers from his briefcase with practiced efficiency. Everything about Blake's operation, names, dates, amounts. We need it all. Every dirty detail. The drive home felt longer than usual, each mile stretching endlessly before him. Calloway's mind raced with what he'd just done. He'd signed the papers, agreed to testify. There was no going back now, no way to undo what he'd set in motion. His store came into view and his heart stopped mid-beat. The front windows were shattered, glass glittering under the harsh streetlights like cruel stars scattered across the sidewalk. The security gate was twisted, bent inward by brute force as if giant hands had pried it apart. A pristine white envelope was pinned to the door with a wicked-looking hunting knife. His hands shook violently as he opened it, the paper crinkling loudly in the empty street. 3 words were typed in bold letters, stark against the white background. "Snitches get buried." Calloway stumbled backward, the paper falling from his nerveless fingers to flutter in the night breeze. Blake knew. Somehow he already knew. The message was clear. There would be no escape, no place to hide from what was coming. Marcus Webb sat at his desk, the harsh fluorescent lights of the newsroom casting long shadows across his tired face. His fingers traced the edge of an unmarked USB drive that had arrived in a plain manila envelope that morning. The cardboard worn and creased as if it had changed hands several times. No return address, no note, just the drive and a yellow post-it with the words "Blake's Legacy" scrawled in hurried handwriting that slanted urgently across the paper. He plugged it in, his heart pounding with anticipation, and his eyes widened as document after damning document filled his screen. Court transcripts, financial records, and internal memos painted a disturbing picture that grew darker with each click. Judge Blake hadn't just been making bad calls. He'd been orchestrating outcomes like a puppet master pulling strings from his chambers. Emails showed him pressuring jurors with veiled threats, deliberately burying crucial evidence and ensuring specific verdicts that lined his pockets. The depth of corruption made Webb's stomach turn and bile rise in his throat. "This is it," he muttered, quickly downloading everything to his laptop while glancing over his shoulder. This is what takes him down. The newsroom had emptied hours ago, the usual buzz of activity replaced by an eerie silence that left Webb alone with his explosive discovery. As he packed up his belongings, stuffing papers into his worn leather messenger bag, movement outside the window caught his eye. A black SUV sat idling across the street, its tinted windows reflecting the yellow glow of the streetlights like a predator's eyes. Webb's pulse quickened as recognition hit. He'd seen that same vehicle earlier that day parked outside his favorite coffee shop on 5th Street. Taking the back exit, Webb hurried to his car, keys clutched so tightly in his hand that they left impressions in his palm. The SUV's engine rumbled to life, a deep, threatening growl in the quiet night. In his rearview mirror, he watched it pull out slowly, keeping a calculated distance that made his skin crawl. The night air was thick with tension as Webb navigated the empty streets, his mind racing through possible escape routes. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air flowing through the vents. The SUV remained steady behind him, like a shadow he couldn't shake, matching his every turn with mechanical precision. The attack came without warning. A motorcycle materialized from nowhere, its rider dressed in black leather that seemed to absorb the darkness around it. Metal flashed in the streetlight, a crowbar swinging with deadly purpose. Glass exploded inward as the weapon connected with Webb's driver's side window, sending crystalline shards flying everywhere. He jerked the wheel instinctively, tires screaming in protest as his car careened off the road. The world spun in a nauseating blur of lights and shadows. Metal crunched and groaned as the car tumbled. When everything stopped moving, Webb found himself in a roadside ditch, his car nose down at an awkward angle that made his stomach lurch. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, warm and sticky against his skin. The motorcycle's engine idled nearby, a menacing purr in the darkness. Heavy boots crunched on broken glass as the masked attacker reached through the shattered window, grabbing Webb's laptop bag and rifling through it with practiced efficiency until he found the USB drive. The attacker leaned in close, his breath fogging the inside of his black helmet in rapid puffs. "Drop the story," he growled, voice muffled but menacing behind the visor. "Or next time we won't leave you breathing. Consider this your only warning." Webb watched helplessly as the motorcycle roared away into the night, the black SUV following close behind like a loyal guard dog. His body ached everywhere, and sharp pains shot through his ribs with each labored breath. But as he stared at the glittering fragments of safety glass scattered across his dashboard like fallen stars, a grim smile crossed his swollen face. Wincing, he reached into his jacket's inner pocket, the one he'd specially reinforced for moments exactly like this. and pulled out another USB drive, identical to the one they'd just stolen. He always made backups, sometimes 3 or 4. It was the first rule of investigative journalism, a lesson learned through years of threats and close calls. The attack hadn't scared him off. It had only proved he was on the right track. If anything, their violent response told him he was closer to the truth than ever before. The morning after the attack, Marcus Webb's explosive article hit the front page of the Daily Chronicle. His face was still bruised and swollen from the beating, but his words struck like lightning through the city's power structure. The headline blazed across newspapers and screens everywhere. Corruption in the courthouse. Judge Blake's prison pipeline exposed. The meticulously researched article laid out everything: the doctored evidence, the substantial kickbacks from private prisons, the systematic targeting of black youth in their community. Webb included damning court documents, detailed financial records, and sworn testimony from former employees who could no longer stay silent. Most damning was the connection to Raymond Calloway's jewelry store, where Blake had deliberately sentenced an innocent teenager while protecting the real thief, a scheme that had destroyed multiple young lives. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire across the nation. Major networks picked it up, social media exploded with outrage, and number Justice for Amara started trending nationwide. Hundreds of protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their handmade signs demanding accountability and reform. Their angry voices echoed off the building's stone walls. Civil rights organizations called for immediate investigations, and several lawmakers issued carefully worded statements expressing deep concern about the allegations. Inside the juvenile detention center's common room, Amara stood among a crowd of inmates, all eyes fixed on the small TV mounted high on the wall. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she watched footage of protesters chanting her name, holding signs with her face on them. She could hardly believe this was real. "Girl, they're finally saying your name," Tasha whispered, squeezing Amara's shoulder with trembling fingers. "The whole world's watching now. They can't ignore us anymore." Judge Blake's response came swift and calculated. He called an emergency press conference, standing before a forest of microphones in his pristine judicial robes, projecting an image of wounded dignity that he had perfected over years of deception. "These outrageous allegations are nothing more than a coordinated attack to undermine our justice system," he declared, his voice steady, but his eyes cold with barely contained fury. "Mr. Webb has a history of sensationalist reporting. Amara Lewis is a dangerous repeat offender whose record speaks for itself. And Eleanor Hayes?" He shook his head sadly, lips curling slightly. "A once respected judge whose bitter vendetta has clearly clouded her judgment." But away from the cameras in his private chambers, Blake's carefully constructed composure cracked like thin ice. He summoned Chief Randall Briggs, slamming his fist on the polished mahogany desk hard enough to scatter papers. "I want every threat eliminated," he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "Every single one. Do whatever it takes, you understand me?" That night, Raymond Calloway walked through the empty parking garage beneath his store, his footsteps echoing off concrete walls in the darkness. The attack came from behind, a figure in black, moving like a shadow in the dim fluorescent light. The first blow caught Calloway in the back of the knees, sending him crashing to the ground with a sickening crack. Fists and steel-toed boots rained down mercilessly on his body. When it was finally over, Calloway lay in a growing pool of his own blood, barely conscious and whimpering softly. The masked attacker grabbed his hair, yanking his head up roughly to whisper in his ear with hot, menacing breath. "Keep your mouth shut or your son gets the next beating. This is your only warning." The footsteps faded away into the darkness, leaving Calloway broken and alone on the cold concrete, the threat hanging in the air like poison. His quiet sobs echoed through the empty garage as distant traffic rumbled overhead, indifferent to his pain. The morning sun barely penetrated the high windows of the juvenile detention center's cafeteria as Amara made her way through the breakfast line. Her stomach churned with unease as she noticed something felt off. The guards were positioning themselves differently today, creating an unusual pattern that left her exposed in the center of the room, like an animal being herded for slaughter. Officer Martinez whispered something to Janelle, a new inmate who had arrived just days ago, his thick fingers gripping her shoulder with barely concealed threat. The girl's face hardened as she glanced at Amara, her shoulders tensing beneath her oversized orange jumpsuit. Other inmates shifted uncomfortably, their plastic trays clutched tight against their chests, sensing the manufactured tension in the air like static before a storm. Amara carefully balanced her tray of lukewarm oatmeal and rubbery eggs, hyper-aware of every movement around her. The guards had been waiting for an excuse, any excuse, to punish her since Webb's article broke. Their eyes followed her like hungry wolves stalking prey, their hands hovering near their batons with practiced casualness. It happened fast. Janelle, pushed from behind by Officer Martinez's meaty hand, stumbled into Amara's path. Food splattered across the grimy linoleum floor in a constellation of beige and yellow. Janelle's face twisted with manufactured rage as she shoved forward again, this time deliberately, though her trembling hands betrayed her reluctance. "Watch where you're going," Janelle snarled, but Amara caught the flicker of reluctance in her eyes, the silent apology hidden beneath the forced aggression. This wasn't personal. It was orchestrated, a performance directed by those who held the keys. Amara took a deliberate step back, hands raised in the universal gesture of peace. "I don't want any trouble," she said softly, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. The guards watched intently, practically salivating at the prospect of violence, their walkie-talkies already in hand. Other inmates formed a circle, some understanding exactly what was happening, others just drawn to the promise of action like moths to a flame. The air grew thick with tension and the metallic smell of fear. Janelle's fist flew toward Amara's face, not a skilled punch but one driven by pressure and fear, her inexperience evident in the telegraphed movement. Acting on pure instinct, Amara blocked it with her forearm, deflecting the blow without striking back, refusing to give them what they wanted. That's all the guards needed. They swarmed in like vultures, grabbing Amara roughly by the arms, their fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave marks. Officer Martinez twisted her wrist painfully behind her back while another guard slammed her face against a table, the cold surface biting into her cheek. "Stop! She didn't do anything!" Tasha's voice rang out above the chaos, raw with desperation. She and Keisha rushed forward, trying to reach Amara through the wall of guards, their faces contorted with helpless anger. The cafeteria erupted into complete chaos. Inmates began throwing trays, chairs, anything they could grab, their fury finding release in the projectiles. The sound of shattering plastic and screaming filled the air as guards lost control of the situation, their carefully orchestrated plan dissolving into pandemonium. Through the mayhem, Amara felt herself being dragged away, her feet barely touching the ground, the linoleum squeaking beneath her stumbling steps. They hauled her down the cold corridor to the solitary confinement wing, their grips bruising her arms as they half-carried, half-dragged her along. The heavy metal door creaked open with an ominous groan to reveal a tiny concrete cell, barely big enough to lie down in, its emptiness yawning like an open grave. The darkness seemed to reach out with greedy fingers as they shoved her inside with unnecessary force. Amara stumbled into the pitch-black space, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The door slammed shut with a final, echoing clang that seemed to seal her fate. Through the small slot, Officer Martinez's voice dripped with cruel satisfaction, each word a poisoned dagger. "No one's coming for you." Amara sat alone in the suffocating darkness, the distant sounds of the riot echoing through the thick walls like ghost voices calling her name. The concrete felt ice-cold against her back as she pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller in the tiny space, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps that seemed too loud in the pressing silence. The darkness wrapped around her like a shroud, but deep inside, a spark of defiance refused to be extinguished. Eleanor Hayes sat in her study, surrounded by towering stacks of legal documents. Her normally pristine desk had disappeared under a sea of case files, each one representing a young life derailed by Judge Blake's corruption. She'd spent weeks meticulously reviewing over 30 cases, finding patterns that couldn't be coincidental, identical phrases in different rulings, suspicious sentencing disparities, and evidence that mysteriously vanished from court records. Her fingers traced the edge of a particularly damning file. "This ends now," she muttered, reaching for her phone to call the Supreme Court clerk she'd known for 20 years. Across town, Damian Cross straightened his tie before entering the federal building. The marble halls echoed with his footsteps as he made his way to meet federal prosecutor Sarah Chen. His briefcase held copies of Blake's most egregious rulings, each one annotated with clear evidence of manipulation. "These aren't isolated incidents," Damian explained, spreading the files across Chen's desk. "This is systematic corruption that demands immediate review." Meanwhile, Marcus Webb's latest investigation had uncovered a web of corruption that stretched far beyond the courthouse. His computer screen displayed a complex network of connections: campaign donations from private prison companies, offshore accounts linked to local politicians, and suspicious real estate deals involving prominent business executives. The evidence was damning. Every wrongful conviction had lined someone's pockets, creating a perfect machine of corruption that turned young lives into profit. Judge Blake paced in his private chamber, his usual composure cracking under pressure. He'd called an emergency meeting with his closest allies, politicians, business executives, and Chief Randall Briggs. The room crackled with nervous energy as these powerful men realized their empire was crumbling. "We need a scapegoat," Blake announced, his voice cold and calculated. His eyes settled on Chief Briggs. "You and Calloway will take the fall." Briggs shot up from his chair, face reddening. "Like hell I will. I've done your dirty work for years." Blake cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Either you take the fall, or I make sure you never see another paycheck again." His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "And we both know what else I could make disappear." Unknown to them, a small recording device captured every word, hidden in the pocket of Webb's informant who sat quietly in the corner, pretending to take notes. The device picked up Blake's casual admission of manipulating cases, his threats against Briggs, and the explicit discussion of their scheme. Hours later, Eleanor found a plain manila envelope on her desk. Inside was a USB drive containing the complete audio recording of Blake's meeting. As she listened, a grim smile spread across her face. After all these years, Blake had finally slipped up, and his own words would be his undoing. The fluorescent lights in solitary confinement buzzed endlessly, driving into Amara's skull like tiny needles. After 5 days in the cramped cell, she knew she had to act. Her heart pounded as she slumped against the wall, letting out a series of violent coughs that echoed down the corridor. "Help!" she called out weakly. "I can't breathe!" 2 guards appeared, peering through the small window. "Lewis is having some kind of attack," one said to the other. They escorted her to the infirmary, supporting her as she stumbled dramatically. The antiseptic smell hit her nose as they laid her on a thin examination bed. While waiting for the nurse, Amara kept her eyes closed but her ears alert. 2 guards stood just outside the door, their voices carrying clearly. Blake called again. "He's done messing around with this one." "Yeah, transfer papers are already being processed, sending her to Riverdale Adult Correctional." Damn, that's harsh for a 17-year-old. "Blake's done playing games. He wants her gone." Amara's blood ran cold. Riverdale was notorious, a place where inmates disappeared into the system, sometimes for decades longer than their sentences. Later that day during kitchen duty, Amara worked alongside Tasha and Keisha. Between the clatter of pots and pans, she whispered her plan. "Loading docks right through there," Tasha muttered, nodding toward a heavy metal door. "Delivery truck comes at 3. "You're crazy," Keisha hissed, "but we got your back." At exactly 3 o'clock, Keisha accidentally dropped a stack of trays, creating a thunderous distraction. In the chaos, Amara slipped through the door and into the loading area. The afternoon sun blinded her momentarily as she crouched behind some empty boxes. Freedom was just yards away. Her heart hammered as she waited for the perfect moment to run. "Going somewhere, Lewis?" A guard's voice froze her in place. Heavy footsteps approached from behind. Warden Graves arrived minutes later, his face twisted with rage. He grabbed Amara's arm roughly, yanking her to her feet. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he snarled. That night, 2 guards appeared at Amara's cell. One held official-looking papers. "Transfer orders," he announced flatly. "You're moving to Riverdale tomorrow morning." Amara stood motionless as they read out the details. Less than 24 hours. Her mind raced, searching for options that didn't exist. As they led her back to her cell, she passed Tasha and Keisha in the common area. Their eyes met briefly, filled with helpless anger and grief. No words were needed. They all knew what Riverdale meant. The cell door clanged shut behind her with devastating finality. Amara sat on her thin mattress, the transfer papers clutched in her trembling hands, realizing she was completely out of options. The midnight silence in the juvenile detention center shattered as heavy boots approached Amara's cell. 2 guards yanked her from her thin mattress, their rough hands leaving bruises as they roughly snapped handcuffs around her wrists and shackles around her ankles. The cold steel scraped against her skin, a harsh reminder of her powerlessness. "Move it!" one guard barked, shoving her forward with unnecessary force that made her stumble. The cold metal bit deeper into her skin as they marched her through the dark corridors, their footsteps echoing ominously off the concrete walls. Her orange jumpsuit offered little protection against the chilly night air when they reached the prison yard, where a white van waited, its engine idling in the darkness like a predator ready to pounce. As they approached the vehicle, Amara heard the guards muttering behind her, their voices carrying clearly in the still night air. "She won't last a week in an adult facility," one whispered, his voice tinged with something almost like pity, a rare crack in their usually stern demeanor. "Blake wants her buried," the other replied flatly, his words as cold as the night air. "That's all that matters." The words sent ice through Amara's veins, freezing her from the inside out. They weren't just transferring her, they were trying to make her disappear completely. As the guards pushed her into the van's steel cage, reality hit hard like a physical blow. If she didn't fight back now, she'd vanish into the system forever, becoming just another forgotten face behind bars. Across town, Eleanor's study blazed with light despite the late hour, warm lamplight spilling from every window. She and Damien worked frantically, papers scattered across her massive mahogany desk as they fought to stop Amara's transfer. Their phones buzzed constantly with updates, creating an urgent symphony of notification sounds. "Marcus just dropped the bomb," Damien announced, his eyes bright with excitement as he held up his phone. "The recording's gone viral. It's everywhere." On every major news network, Judge Blake's voice played clearly, his arrogance captured perfectly in the recording. "We need a scapegoat. We pin this on Briggs and Calloway." The evidence of corruption was undeniable, his words damning in their clarity. Social media exploded like wildfire. Free Amara trended nationwide, spreading faster than anyone could have predicted. Protesters gathered outside the governor's mansion, their chants growing louder by the minute, voices joining together in a powerful chorus. "Free Amara, stop the transfer." The prison van rumbled down empty streets, its headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Amara stared through the mesh barrier, counting turns, refusing to give up hope, even as each mile took her further from everything she knew. They were approaching the highway when the driver suddenly hit the brakes, the van lurching to a stop. "What the hell?" he muttered, leaning forward over the steering wheel in disbelief. Ahead, hundreds of protesters blocked the road, their bodies forming an impenetrable wall of resistance. Their signs glowed under street lamps like beacons of hope. "Justice for Amara" and "Stop Corrupt Judges." News vans lined the street, cameras rolling as the crowd chanted with increasing intensity. The guards swore, frantically trying to find another route, but their radios crackled to life with unmistakable authority. A court clerk's voice came through, clear and official. "Emergency stay ordered on prisoner transfer. Return Lewis to juvenile detention immediately." The driver slammed his hand against the steering wheel in frustration. "This is garbage." "Orders are orders," his partner growled, resignation heavy in his voice. "Turn it around." Under the glare of news cameras and the thunderous roar of the crowd, the van slowly turned back, defeated by the power of public outcry. Amara felt tears rolling down her cheeks, tears of relief, of hope, of disbelief that people were actually fighting for her, standing up against injustice in her name. Through the van's window, she caught glimpses of faces in the crowd, young, old, all races, all united in demanding her freedom. Some held candles, Others raised phones with lights shining bright, creating a sea of illumination in the darkness. For the first time since her arrest, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the system wouldn't win this time. The sight of so many strangers standing up for justice gave her something she'd almost lost completely: hope. Judge Conrad Blake's perfectly manicured hand trembled as he picked up the morning newspaper, his gold signet ring catching the early light. His own face stared back at him from the front page, alongside damning headlines in bold black letters: "Leaked recording exposes corrupt judge," and "Bribery, private prison scandal linked to juvenile sentencing." The photo they'd chosen showed him at his most arrogant, sneering down from his bench in his black robes. The pristine quiet of his mansion felt suffocating as he reached for his phone, his breakfast cooling untouched on the mahogany desk. The screen lit up with notifications: 47 missed calls, 93 text messages, and countless email alerts. His fingers shook as he dialed familiar numbers, one after another, but each call went straight to voicemail. Senators, business partners, fellow judges, people who dined at his table just days ago, laughing at his jokes and praising his wisdom, were now avoiding him like a plague. Even his most trusted friend, Senator Williams, sent a terse text: "Don't contact me again. My office will be releasing a statement condemning your actions." The betrayal stung like a physical blow. Blake paced his study, expensive loafers wearing a path in the Persian rug, as he frantically dialed Chief Randall Briggs's number. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he waited. After 4 rings, Briggs answered. "Fix this," Blake hissed into the phone, his knuckles white against the receiver. "Use whatever resources you need. Make it disappear." The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably long before Briggs spoke, his voice unnaturally calm, almost detached. "I can't do that, Your Honor." "What do you mean you can't?" Blake's voice rose sharply, cracking with panic. "That's your job, to handle these situations." "The FBI's been questioning me since dawn," Briggs replied flatly. "They have records, Judge. Bank statements, recordings. They know about everything. The kickbacks, the private prison deals, all of it. Every dirty secret we've buried." Blake's blood ran cold, his legs weakening beneath him. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying I made a deal," Briggs stated simply, without a hint of remorse. "Full immunity in exchange for my testimony against you and the others. I'm not going down for this, Blake. Not for you, not for anyone." The phone slipped from Blake's fingers, clattering on his desk like a death knell. His empire, built over decades of careful manipulation and backroom deals, was unraveling thread by thread, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. As evening settled over his exclusive neighborhood, Blake sat in his darkened study, nursing his 3rd glass of scotch, the amber liquid offering no comfort. The sound of car doors slamming outside made him jump, sloshing the expensive liquor onto his sleeve. Through the window, he watched black SUVs pull up to his circular driveway, their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness like accusing fingers. Men in FBI jackets emerged, moving with purposeful strides toward his front door, their faces set with grim determination. The doorbell rang, its chime echoing through the empty house like a funeral toll. Blake's hands gripped his desk as he watched one agent hold up a search warrant against his security camera, the paper stark white in the twilight. His phone buzzed one final time. A text from his lawyer. "Don't say anything, I'm on my way." But Blake barely registered the message, his world shrinking to a pinpoint. All he could focus on was the sound of his front door opening as his housekeeper let in the FBI agents, her voice small and frightened. Their footsteps echoed through his marble foyer, each step marking the end of everything he'd built, every lie he'd told, every life he'd ruined for profit. The sound of justice, he realized with bitter irony, had come for him at last. The familiar courtroom felt different this time. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting a warm glow that seemed to wash away the shadows of that dark day 6 months ago. Amara sat straight-backed in the witness chair, her orange jumpsuit replaced with a simple blue dress her mother had brought. Her hands, free of shackles, rested steady in her lap, though her heart thundered in her chest. Judge Patricia Martinez, a stern-faced woman with kind eyes, looked nothing like Blake. Where he had towered with cruelty, she sat with quiet dignity, her silver-rimmed glasses catching the light as she reviewed the documents before her. The gallery behind Amara was packed. Her mother Denise, Eleanor, Damien, Marcus Webb, and faces she recognized from the protests outside the juvenile detention center. Their presence gave her strength, each familiar face a reminder of why she had to keep fighting. Blake sat at the defense table, his expensive suit now wrinkled, his arrogance replaced by barely concealed fear. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his normally perfectly combed hair showed signs of neglect. He wouldn't meet her eyes, instead fidgeting with his pen and shuffling papers. "Miss Lewis," the prosecutor began, adjusting her glasses with steady hands, "please tell the court about the day you were arrested." Amara's voice rang clear and strong as she described everything: the false arrest, Blake's prejudiced comments, the rushed trial, the fabricated evidence. She detailed the harsh conditions in juvenile detention, the guards' attempts to provoke her, the isolation cells. Her words painted vivid pictures of sleepless nights on thin mattresses and meals eaten in tense silence. "They wanted us broken," she testified, her chin lifting slightly. "They tried to make us give up hope." When shown the surveillance footage from the jewelry store, now enhanced and clearly showing Bryce Calloway, Amara pointed out all the differences between herself and the actual thief. The height, the build, the way they walked, nothing matched. Her finger traced each detail on the screen with precise movements, her voice steady and confident. Raymond Calloway took the stand next, his face bruised purple and yellow, arm in a sling. His voice shook as he confessed, his good hand gripping the wooden railing of the witness stand so hard his knuckles turned white. "It was my son, Bryce. He stole the necklace. Judge Blake... Calloway swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Judge Blake told me if I blamed Amara Lewis, he'd make sure Bryce stayed out of trouble. I knew it was wrong, but I was trying to protect my son." He turned to Amara, tears in his eyes, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The evidence mounted: bank records showing Blake's kickbacks from private prisons, documentation of his targeted sentencing of black youth, the recorded confession of his conspiracy with Chief Briggs. Each piece fell into place like a puzzle, revealing a picture of corruption, a web of deceit that had trapped countless young lives. Judge Martinez's gavel crack echoed through the hushed courtroom, making several people jump. "Based on the overwhelming evidence of judicial misconduct and witness testimony, I hereby overturn the conviction of Amara Lewis. Miss Lewis, you are free to go. Court officers, please take Judge Blake into custody." Amara stood on shaking legs as the bailiff opened the gate separating her from her mother. Denise rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her daughter. Tears streamed down her face as she held Amara tight, her familiar coconut shampoo filling Amara's nose with memories of home. "My baby," Denise whispered, her voice thick with emotion, her hands stroking Amara's hair. "You're coming home." They walked toward the courthouse doors together, past the reporters and cameras, past Blake being led away in handcuffs, past the marble columns that had once seemed so threatening. Sunlight touched Amara's face as she stepped outside, truly free for the first time in 6 months. The spring air carried the sweet scent of blooming cherry trees, and somewhere in the distance, a bird sang. The jury filed back into the courtroom after 6 hours of deliberation. Their faces were solemn, carrying the weight of months of testimony and mountains of evidence. The forewoman, a middle-aged teacher with steel-gray hair, held the verdict sheet with steady hands. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of protesters pressed against police barriers, their signs demanding justice waving in the autumn breeze. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray sky like metal fingers. Reporters stood before cameras speaking in hushed tones about the historic nature of the trial. Inside, Judge Martinez's courtroom was packed to capacity. Eleanor sat beside Amara and her mother, her usually composed face tight with anticipation. Damien Cross leaned forward in his seat, while Marcus Webb scribbled frantically in his notebook. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Martinez asked, her voice cutting through the tension. "We have, Your Honor," the forewoman replied. Blake sat at the defense table, his expensive suit now hanging loose on his frame. His hands trembled slightly as he stood to face the jury. On the charge of accepting bribes from private prison corporations, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of tampering with evidence in multiple cases? Guilty. On the charge of conspiracy leading to wrongful imprisonment? Guilty. Each guilty verdict landed like a hammer blow. Blake's shoulders slumped further with each pronouncement, his face growing ashen. In the gallery, Amara squeezed her mother's hand, tears rolling silently down both their cheeks. Judge Martinez adjusted her glasses, looking down at Blake with stern disappointment. Conrad Blake, you have betrayed the sacred trust placed in you as a judge. You have corrupted the very system you swore to uphold, destroying lives for personal gain. She paused, letting her words sink in. I hereby sentence you to 20 years in federal prison, without the possibility of early parole. The gavel cracked and Blake's legs gave out. He collapsed into his chair as court officers approached to take him into custody. 6 months later, Amara walked across the campus of State University, her backpack full of law books. Autumn leaves crunched under her feet as she passed the law building. Through an open window, she heard a professor's voice carrying out to the quad. The Blake case represents one of the most significant examples of judicial corruption in recent history, the professor was saying. It exposed not just one corrupt judge, but an entire system of exploitation. Amara paused, a small smile playing on her lips. She glanced through the window at the classroom full of students taking notes, all of them studying a story she had lived through. Her story was now part of their textbooks, part of legal history. The autumn sun felt different on Amara's skin as she walked through the metal gates of the juvenile detention center. Her legs trembled with each step, the weight of freedom almost too heavy to bear. The scratchy orange jumpsuit was gone, replaced by jeans and a soft blue sweater her mother had brought. The fabric felt foreign against her skin after so many months in institutional clothing. A crowd of supporters lined the pathway, holding signs and cheering. Some were familiar faces from the community, others strangers who'd followed her case. Camera flashes popped like lightning, but Amara barely registered them. Her eyes fixed on the small group waiting at the end of the path. Her mother Denise, tears streaming down her face. Her brother Malik, standing tall and proud. Eleanor, composed but smiling warmly. And Damien trying to hide his emotion behind a casual stance, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. "Baby girl," Denise whispered, pulling Amara into a tight embrace. The familiar scent of her mother's perfume brought fresh tears to Amara's eyes. She breathed it in deeply, letting the sweet vanilla notes wash away the sterile smell of the detention center. Malik wrapped his strong arms around both of them, creating a protective circle of family, his chin resting gently on top of Amara's head. Back home, the adjustment proved harder than Amara had imagined. Night after night, she jolted awake in her own bed, convinced she was back in solitary confinement. The darkness felt suffocating, and even the soft click of the bathroom door made her heart race. Sometimes she'd find herself standing in the middle of her room, disoriented, unsure if this freedom was just another cruel dream. One particularly bad night, she found Malik sitting in the kitchen, a cup of tea waiting for her, steam curled up from the mug, carrying the soothing scent of chamomile. "I know that look," he said softly. "I had it too. Saw it in the mirror every morning for months after I got out." "How did you—" Amara's voice cracked. "How did you learn to live again?" Malik pulled out a chair for her, the wooden legs scraping gently against the linoleum floor. "First, you breathe. Deep and slow." He demonstrated, and Amara followed his lead, matching his steady rhythm. "They took our time, sis. Days and months we can't get back, but we decide what happens next. That's the one thing they can't control anymore." He taught her grounding techniques, feeling the texture of her blanket, counting the books on her shelf, focusing on the sound of rain against the window. Small steps toward reclaiming control. Each night got a little easier, though the memories never fully faded. One evening, Amara sat cross-legged on the couch, watching a news report about the aftermath of Blake's conviction. The reporter stood outside the same juvenile detention center she'd left, talking about dozens of cases under review. Her mother bustled around in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of dinner preparation a comforting backdrop. Many teens remain incarcerated while their cases are examined, the reporter said. The process could take months, even years. Her professional tone couldn't mask the gravity of the situation. The camera panned to show young faces pressed against barred windows. Amara recognized those expressions, the mix of hope and despair, the desperate need for someone to fight for them. Her hands clenched into fists, fingernails digging into her palms. "I can't just move on," she said to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're still in there, still waiting, still hoping someone remembers them." She pulled out her phone and started making a list of names she remembered from inside, girls who'd been sentenced by Blake, girls whose stories echoed her own. Her hand shook slightly, but her writing was clear and determined. Each name represented another life put on hold, another family torn apart by corruption. "I have to help them," she declared, her voice stronger now, filled with purpose. "They need someone who understands what they're going through, someone who won't give up on them." The screen of her phone illuminated her face in the growing darkness, reflecting the fierce determination in her eyes. The courthouse buzzed with tension as Bryce Calloway stood before the judge, his designer suit no longer projecting the confidence it once did. His perfectly styled hair looked disheveled, and dark circles rimmed his eyes, clear signs of sleepless nights since his arrest. His father's damning testimony played on repeat in his mind. Raymond Calloway's words had been clear and unflinching. "My son stole that jewelry. He bragged about it, and an innocent girl went to prison because of our lies." Bryce's high-powered defense team tried every trick they knew. They painted him as a troubled young man from a good family who just needed rehabilitation. They suggested community service and probation would be more appropriate than prison time. But the public gallery's hostile murmurs told a different story. The judge, a stern woman with graying hair, looked down at Bryce with barely concealed disgust. "Mr. Calloway, your actions didn't just constitute theft. You allowed an innocent young woman to be imprisoned for your crime. You watched silently as her life was torn apart. This court cannot ignore such a callous disregard for human dignity." The sentence came down like a hammer, 5 years in state prison. Bryce's legs nearly gave out. His lawyers quickly steadied him, but their reassuring touches couldn't mask the reality of what was happening. In his holding cell, Bryce sat on the cold metal bench, his head in his hands. The orange jumpsuit felt rough against his skin, nothing like the silk shirts he was used to. Through the bars, he could hear other inmates talking, their voices echoing off concrete walls. Someone mentioned Blake's kids, the young black men and women who'd been wrongfully sentenced by the corrupt judge. A guard walked past, smirking. "Guess where you're headed, rich boy?" "Same place those kids went. Funny how things work out, isn't it?" Bryce's stomach churned. The reality of his situation hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't special anymore. His father's money couldn't protect him. The system he'd exploited was about to swallow him whole. Before his transfer, Raymond Calloway visited his son one last time. The meeting room was stark and cold, with a scratched plastic divider between them. Bryce barely recognized his father. The proud, powerful man looked decades older, beaten down by guilt and shame. "Dad?" Bryce started, his voice cracking. "Can't you do something? Call someone?" Raymond's face hardened. "I protected you your whole life, cleaned up your messes, paid off your problems, but you never learned. Now no one can save you." "I didn't mean for..." "For what? For that girl to go to prison? For lives to be ruined? You didn't mean it, but you let it happen. You laughed about it." Raymond's voice shook with anger and disappointment. "Now you get to understand exactly what you put those other kids through." Bryce stared at his father through the divider, tears welling in his eyes as the full weight of his actions finally sank in. But as Raymond had said, it was too late. Far too late. Sometime later, Eleanor Hayes stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee, her voice steady and clear as she testified about the urgent need for reform. The grand chamber fell silent as she detailed the corruption she had witnessed firsthand. What happened to Amara Lewis wasn't an isolated incident, Eleanor explained, her fingers gripping the podium. It was a symptom of a system designed to profit from young lives destroyed. Senators leaned forward in their seats as Eleanor presented document after document showing the connection between corrupt judges and private prison kickbacks. Charts and graphs displayed on large screens revealed the disturbing pattern: minority youth receiving harsher sentences in districts with private prison contracts. The Judicial Accountability Act will ensure no judge can ever again treat our children like commodities, Eleanor said, her words echoing through the chamber. Later that afternoon, in the warmth of Eleanor's library, sunlight streamed through tall windows as she sat across from Amara. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines gleaming. The room smelled of old paper and wisdom. "When I first saw you in that courtroom," Eleanor said softly, "I knew I had to act." Amara looked up from the legal brief she was studying. "Because you wanted justice?" Eleanor's eyes softened as she gazed at the young woman before her. "Because I saw myself in you." She reached down beside her chair and lifted a stack of well-worn law books onto the table between them. Each one was filled with colored tabs and handwritten notes in the margins. "These books," Eleanor continued, running her hand along their spines, "they carried me through my early days as a lawyer, through every fight, every setback, every victory." She pushed them gently toward Amara. "Now they're yours." Amara's fingers trembled as she opened the top book, seeing Eleanor's neat handwriting filling the margins with insights and strategies gathered over decades. On her final day at the office, Eleanor packed the last of her personal items into a cardboard box. Awards and certificates came down from the walls. Photos of landmark cases were carefully wrapped. She paused at her desk, touching its smooth surface one last time. As she walked through the building's quiet halls, Eleanor stopped at the law library. Through the glass doors, she saw Amara hunched over a thick textbook, preparing for her upcoming law school entrance exam. Sticky notes and highlighters surrounded her like bright confetti, her face set with determination. Eleanor smiled, knowing the torch was being passed to capable hands. Without disturbing Amara's concentration, she turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor for the last time. Days later, Amara Lewis stood in front of the imposing courthouse steps, her heart beating steadily as memories washed over her. The last time she'd climbed these stairs, she'd been in handcuffs, wearing a faded hoodie. Now she adjusted her crisp navy suit and gripped her leather briefcase tighter. The marble halls echoed with her confident footsteps as she made her way to courtroom 3. She paused at the heavy wooden doors, taking a deep breath. The brass handle felt cool beneath her fingers as she pushed them open. Inside, the morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The room looked smaller now, less intimidating than it had when she was 17. But the weight of what happened here still pressed against her chest. Her client, 14-year-old Marcus Thompson, sat at the defense table in clothes too big for his frame. His mother, like Amara's had years ago, gripped the bench behind him with worried hands. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, the same fear Amara had felt in this very room. "All rise," the bailiff called out. "The Honorable Judge Sarah Chen presiding." Judge Chen entered, her robes flowing as she took her seat. Unlike Blake's cold stare, her eyes were alert and attentive, studying the room with genuine interest. She had a reputation for fairness, for listening before judging. "Case number 2472, People v. Thompson," the clerk announced. Amara stood, smoothing her jacket. The familiar smell of wood polish and anxiety filled her nostrils. But this time she wasn't powerless. This time she had the law on her side. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and strong. "The defense is ready." The prosecutor, a young man in an ill-fitting suit, presented the state's case. Security camera footage, a witness statement, circumstantial evidence. The same type of flimsy case that had once sent Amara away. Marcus fidgeted beside her, his hands trembling. Amara placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, remembering how alone she had felt. She leaned close and whispered, Trust me. I won't let them do to you what they did to me." When it was her turn, Amara rose slowly. The courtroom fell silent. She could feel every eye on her. The bailiff who had once shackled her, the court reporter who had recorded her pleas of innocence, the observers who sat in judgment. She approached the bench, her heels clicking against the floor. Judge Chen looked down, not with contempt like Blake had, but with genuine attention. "Your Honor," Amara said, her voice steady and clear. She thought of Eleanor, of all the lessons learned, of every night spent studying to reach this moment. "This time, you will hear the truth." Hours later, Amara Lewis sat across from Jalen Carter in the detention center's visiting room, the familiar smell of industrial cleaner and fear bringing back memories she'd rather forget. The harsh fluorescent lights cast unflattering shadows across the institutional beige walls, making everyone look sickly and defeated. The 16-year-old boy wore the same orange jumpsuit she once had, his shoulders hunched under the weight of a system designed to break him. His hands fidgeted nervously with the sleeve of his uniform, a gesture she remembered all too well. "They say I robbed the convenience store," Jalen said, his voice barely above a whisper, cracking with emotion. "But I was at my cousin's house that night. We were playing video games. I swear it wasn't me." Amara opened the case file, spreading photos and documents across the metal table. The cold surface reminded her of countless interrogations she'd endured herself. The evidence was painfully familiar. A grainy security video, a vague witness description, a rushed police lineup. Just like her case, the prosecution had built their story on shadows and assumptions, weaving a narrative that ignored crucial facts and alibis. "Do you believe me?" Jalen asked, his eyes searching her face for any sign of doubt, desperate for someone to finally hear his truth. "I don't need to believe," Amara replied, her voice firm and steady, carrying the weight of her own experience. "I know how this system works, and I'm getting you out. I promise." Across town, news stations buzzed with updates about the ongoing fallout from Judge Blake's conviction. Channel 7 showed footage of families reuniting as more wrongfully convicted individuals walked free, their faces streaked with tears of joy and disbelief. The anchor's voice carried over images of tearful embraces. Another dozen cases overturned this week as the review of Judge Conrad Blake's rulings continues, bringing the total number of exonerations to over 50. The class action lawsuit against Private Corrections Corporation dominated headlines, growing larger by the day. Former inmates testified about extended sentences, abuse, and corruption, their stories painting a damning picture of systematic exploitation. Law firms across the country joined forces, determined to dismantle the profit-driven system that had destroyed so many lives, leaving broken families and shattered dreams in its wake. Later that week, Amara drove to the juvenile detention center where she'd spent 18 months of her life. The familiar gates loomed before her, still intimidating despite her freedom. The guard at the gate recognized her, his face showing a mix of shame and respect as he waved her through. She wasn't here as an inmate or even as a lawyer. Today was about closure, about facing the demons that still haunted her dreams. In the visiting room, Tasha and Keisha waited, both looking smaller somehow in their civilian clothes. Both women were being released after their cases were reviewed and overturned, finally free after years of wrongful imprisonment. When they saw Amara, their faces lit up with genuine joy, the kind that only comes from shared survival. "Look at you," Keisha exclaimed, pulling Amara into a tight hug, her voice thick with emotion. "Power suit and everything. Damn, girl, you really made it. You're showing them all." Tasha joined the embrace, her usual tough exterior softening for a moment, tears glistening in her eyes. When they pulled apart, she fixed Amara with a serious look, her expression carrying years of hard-won wisdom. "Now don't forget about the ones still trapped. We need you fighting for them too." Amara nodded, feeling the weight of their words settle deep in her chest. She thought about Jalen, about all the others still fighting for justice, their stories echoing her own. The orange jumpsuits, the cold cells, the system designed to swallow them whole. It was all still here, still hungry for more victims, still waiting to be dismantled piece by corrupted piece. The grand ballroom of the Justice Center sparkled with elegant lighting, and the quiet murmur of distinguished guests. Judges, lawyers, and activists gathered to honor Eleanor Hayes, whose decades of service had transformed the legal landscape. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the crowd as Amara Lewis approached the podium, her heart full of emotion. The polished marble floors reflected the soft lighting, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the historic building. She smoothed her navy suit, took a deep breath, and began. When I first met Eleanor Hayes, I was wearing prison orange, standing in chains before a corrupt judge. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Today I stand before you as a defense attorney, fighting for others like me, because Eleanor taught me that justice isn't given. It's fought for, day after day, in every courtroom across this country. Eleanor sat in the front row, her silver hair elegantly styled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She wore a simple but striking black dress, her hands folded carefully in her lap as she listened to Amara's words. Her presence commanded respect, just as it had throughout her remarkable career. Eleanor Hayes didn't just save my life, Amara continued, her voice strong and clear. She showed us all that the system can be changed when good people refuse to stay silent. She taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about facing your fears and fighting anyway. When Eleanor finally took the stage, accepting the Crystal Award with graceful hands, she paused. The silence stretched, heavy with anticipation. Then, her voice rang out, firm and unwavering. Power unchecked will always seek to exploit the powerless. That is why we fight. That is why we must never stop fighting. After the ceremony, Eleanor led Amara to a quiet corner of the building, their heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The celebrations continued in the distance, but here, in this moment, it was just the two of them. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a cream-colored envelope, slightly yellowed with age, its corners worn soft with time. I wrote this before I ever saw you in that courtroom, Eleanor explained, pressing the letter into Amara's hands. Before I knew your name or your story, but somehow I knew you were coming. I knew someone would rise up to carry this torch forward. Amara's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. The pages inside were filled with Eleanor's elegant handwriting, telling stories of courtroom battles fought decades ago, of being the only black woman in rooms full of white men who doubted her every word. Eleanor wrote about cases that still haunted her, young lives destroyed by a system that saw them as statistics rather than human beings. The paper carried the faint scent of age and wisdom, each word a testament to years of struggle and perseverance. Tears rolled down Amara's cheeks as she read about Eleanor's own struggles, her victories, and most painfully, the cases she couldn't win. The letter spoke of sleepless nights spent questioning whether one person could really make a difference in a system so deeply flawed. Each page revealed another layer of the woman who had become her mentor and champion. Eleanor watched quietly as Amara absorbed every word. When Amara looked up, their eyes met in shared understanding, the weight of the past, the responsibility of the future, all contained in that simple exchange of glances. The bond between them, forged in struggle and strengthened by determination, spoke louder than words. As Eleanor prepared to leave, she paused at the building's entrance. The setting sun cast long shadows through the glass doors, highlighting the silver in her hair. She turned back one final time to look at Amara, who stood clutching the letter to her chest like a precious treasure. "I won't let you down," Amara whispered, her voice carrying the weight of both promise and determination. The words echoed in the empty hallway, a solemn vow between two generations of warriors for justice. Judge Conrad Blake hunched over his metal tray in the federal prison cafeteria, pushing bland mashed potatoes around with a plastic spork. His once pristine silver hair had dulled to a lifeless gray, matching the pallor of his gaunt face. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under his sunken eyes, making him look like a ghost of his former self. The constant hum of the overhead lights and clatter of trays only emphasized how far he'd fallen from his mahogany-paneled chambers. 2 tables away, inmates whispered and pointed, their voices carrying just loud enough for him to hear, their contempt evident in every word. "That's the corrupt judge who sent kids to prison for kickbacks," Heard he got 20 years. Karma's something, ain't it? My cousin got 15 years from that monster. Blake kept his eyes down, trying to make himself smaller. The starched orange jumpsuit felt like sandpaper against his skin, so different from the silk-lined robes he once wore while sentencing others to the same fate. His shoulders hunched forward as if they could shield him from the weight of all those accusatory stares. The cafeteria grew quiet as 3 men approached his table, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Blake recognized the first one immediately, Marcus Thompson, a young man he'd sentenced to 10 years for a petty theft charge that should have gotten probation. Marcus's face bore the hardened lines of someone who'd grown up behind bars, his youth stolen by Blake's greed. Well, look who it is, Marcus said, sliding onto the bench across from Blake. The Honorable Judge Blake himself. His voice dripped with sarcasm on the word honorable. Blake's hands trembled as he set down his spork, the metal tray rattling slightly beneath his shaking fingers. Remember me, Judge? 10 years for a crime I didn't commit. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and controlled, eyes boring into Blake's. 10 years of my life gone, because you needed to fill those private prison beds. 10 years of watching my mother cry during visits, wondering why the system failed us. The second man spoke up, his deep voice thick with emotion. You gave me 15 years when I was 19. My daughter grew up without a father because of you. She was learning to walk when I went in. Now she's in high school. Blake tried to stand, but Marcus's hand shot out, gripping his arm. Not roughly, but firmly enough to keep him in place, a reminder of their reversed positions of power. No running away this time, Judge. No bailiff to protect you. No gavel to hide behind. Just you and the consequences of what you did to us. Blake's voice came out as a whisper, barely audible over the cafeteria's background noise. I was just following the law. The law? Marcus laughed bitterly, the sound echoing off the institutional walls. You were the law, and you twisted it to serve yourself. You broke more than just laws. You broke families, lives, communities. A guard walked past, keys jingling at his belt, and the men released Blake's arm. But their presence remained, a reminder of all his past sins come back to haunt him, each face representing hundreds more whose lives he'd destroyed for profit. That evening, in his cell, Blake received a newspaper from his court-appointed lawyer, the pages slightly wrinkled from passing through security. The headline made his stomach turn. Landmark Criminal Justice Reform Bill passes. Blake Act aims to prevent judicial corruption. His hands shook as he read about the new oversight committees, the restrictions on judicial discretion, the regular reviews of sentencing patterns. Everything he had fought against, everything he had called soft on crime was now law. Each paragraph felt like another nail in the coffin of his legacy. The article mentioned him by name. His case had become the catalyst for change. His decades of abuse had led to reforms that would prevent others from doing what he had done. His shame would live on in legislation designed to protect the very people he had victimized. Blake crumpled the newspaper, letting it fall to the floor of his 6x8 cell. For the first time since his arrest, he felt the true weight of his powerlessness. The system he had manipulated for so long had finally turned against men like him. In the growing darkness of his cell, he realized that his greatest punishment wasn't the prison sentence. It was knowing that his name would forever be associated with the reform of the corrupt system he had once controlled. The packed university auditorium hummed with anticipation as Amara Lewis approached the podium. Her heels clicked against the polished wood of the stage, each step deliberate and confident. The room fell silent as she adjusted the microphone, her dark eyes scanning the sea of eager faces before her. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the gathered crowd. She looked different now, older, wiser, with an air of quiet authority that came from years of fighting in the trenches of justice. Her suit was crisp and professional, a far cry from the prison jumpsuit she'd worn all those years ago. A small silver pendant, a gift from Eleanor, gleamed at her throat, a reminder of how far she'd come. "The law failed me," she began, her voice clear and strong. "But it also saved me." The difference was, who was willing to fight, Her words carried to the farthest corners of the room, touching something deep within each listener. The students leaned forward in their seats, notebooks open, pens poised. Some typed frantically on laptops, but most just listened, captivated by the weight of her words. The occasional cough or shuffle of papers only emphasized the intense focus in the room. When I stood in that courtroom at 17, shackled and afraid, I thought the system was too big to fight, too powerful to change. She paused, letting the words sink in. Her hands gripped the podium's edges, knuckles whitening slightly. I was wrong. The system only works when good people stay silent. In the middle of the audience, she spotted a familiar face, Jalen Carter. He sat straight-backed, his law book spread across the desk in front of him. Their eyes met, and they shared a knowing smile. Just 3 years ago, he'd been behind bars, another victim of the system. Now he was in his second year of law school, following the path she'd blazed. His presence was a testament to the change she fought for every day. Amara continued her speech, sharing stories of battles won and lost in courtrooms across the country. She spoke about Eleanor Hayes, about the importance of mentorship, about the responsibility each future lawyer carried to protect justice. Her voice grew passionate as she described the small victories that had kept her going through the darkest times. As she concluded her lecture, the applause thundered through the hall. Students rose to their feet, some wiping tears from their eyes, others nodding with newfound determination. The standing ovation lasted several minutes, the energy in the room electric with possibility. Walking down the auditorium steps, Amara gathered her briefcase and notes. The crowd of students parted respectfully, many wanting to speak with her but hesitating to approach. Their whispered conversations and admiring glances followed her progress. Suddenly, a young black girl, no more than 12, pushed through the crowd. She clutched a legal textbook to her chest, her eyes bright with admiration as she approached Amara. Her braids bounced with each determined step, reminding Amara of herself at that age. "Miss Lewis," the girl called out, slightly breathless from running, "I want to be just like you." Her voice trembled with emotion and determination. Amara set down her briefcase and knelt to meet the girl's eye level. With a warm smile, she responded, "Then let's get to work." She saw in the girl's eyes the same fire that Eleanor had recognized in her own so many years ago. If you enjoyed the story of Amara, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.